Okay, so this is going to be part four here, and we're going to start here by talking about different types of fibers. And so we have three types of fibers that kind of run throughout our brain. And what these are doing is they are adjoining or connecting different parts of the brain with each other. Okay, so our brain is we separate it into hemispheres and into lobes, but in reality, it's all connected in some way or another. So we have three main fiber types. Um, that we will take a look at. We have association fibers, we have commissural fibers, and projection fibers. So and I will show you a picture of these, and it'll make maybe a little bit more sense when I show you the picture. So association fibers are going to be those that connect areas that are associated with each other within the same cerebral hemisphere. So both in the left, both in the right. If you remember our motor area called Broca's area, and one of our integration areas called Wernicke's area, there are some association fibers connecting these two regions in the brain because they're both having to do something with language or spoken language and things like that. So there's going to be association fibers that run and actually connect these two together. You have commissural fibers or a commissure that connect different regions of the different hemispheres, so left and right being connected together. And we have the largest commissural fiber, or a group of commissural fibers, is known as the corpus callosum. And you see in a sagittal section of a brain, in a sagittal view, a mid-sagittal view, it is this large kind of C-shaped region of white matter that is just above our kind of diencephalon region. And it is this large commissural fiber, commissural tract, that's connecting our left hemisphere, our left cerebral hemisphere, with our right cerebral hemisphere. And then lastly, we have projection fibers, which connect our upper part of our cerebrum, extend down through the brain, and connect us to our lower spinal cord. So our lower part of our brain and our spinal cord going down there. So if we take a look here, you can see association fibers along the same hemisphere, so maybe from Broca's area back here to Wernicke's area. We can see commissural fibers connecting both hemispheres together, left and right. And then we see projection fibers starting at the upper part of our brain, our cerebral cortex, and extending down into our brainstem and ultimately down into our spinal cord. Here's our corpus callosum, this large kind of C-shaped region just above our diencephalon here. And this is the largest commissural tract, commissural fiber that is connecting our two cerebral hemispheres. Okay. So we'll talk a little bit about something known as basal nuclei. Now, sometimes they're referred to as basal nuclei, sometimes they're referred to as basal ganglia. See, I have here basal ganglia and basal nuclei. The more appropriate name for them between basal nuclei and ganglia is truly basal nuclei. And the reason for that is if something is a ganglia, when you're talking about the nervous system, that is a group of cell bodies located outside of the central nervous system. But these basal nuclei, as we'll see, and because we're talking about the central nervous system, this is a group of cell bodies that is actually located within the central nervous system. So truly the more accurate term for this is the basal nuclei. So that's what I'll try to refer to them as. But if you read in your textbook, if you read literature online or anything like that, you'll often see them referred to as basal ganglia, and that's just something that's been around for a long time. So what it is these are different kind of aggregations of gray matter. So we know that gray matter is not white matter, so it does not contain myelin, and so parts of the neuron that are non-myelinated or unmyelinated are generally the cell bodies. And so this is a cluster of cell bodies kind of surrounded by a bunch of other white matter. And we have three main basal nuclei, and we will name them. So we have the caudate nuclei, we have one called the putamen, and we have one called the globus pallidus. Okay, and so these are largely responsible for helping us initiate motor activities, so some type of motor signal, an efferent signal going out of our central nervous system, as well as kind of controlling and regulating those movements and activities. So here you can see this kind of C-shaped one. This is the caudate nucleus. Here you can see the putamen, and then the globus pallidus would be kind of deep to this. If we look over here on the right, we can see this little cluster of gray matter here as being the caudate nucleus, and then here a little bit lower you can see the putamen. Now, the term caudate, caudate refers to tail, and if you look at this on this image here on the left again, it kind of sweeps around and kind of ends in this tail-like shape, and so it's referred to as the caudate. If you take the putamen and the globus pallidus and you combine them together, you can actually get something known as the lentiform nucleus, and so it's just a combination of kind of this putamen and globus pallidus kind of joining together. And so, like I said, these are involved in initiating and kind of controlling and regulating motor activities. So starting it, stopping it, and then monitoring it and regulating it. So you can imagine if you had a disease or you had some type of dysfunction of this basal nuclei or of some of these groups of basal nuclei, you would have problems with something involving your motor movement. Okay, and so that's exactly what we see in people with Parkinson's disease. So in Parkinson's disease, you have dopamine secreting cells here in your brain that are part of this basal nuclei. And dopamine is somewhat of an inhibitory neuron when it comes to motor movement. And so necessary adequate amounts of dopamine are necessary to kind of counteract skeletal muscle stimulation and motor stimulation of skeletal muscles. And so when you lose these dopamine secreting cells, these dopamine secreting neurons up here in the brain and the basal nuclei, what you end up with is an overactive motor signals. And so this is, you'll see if you've ever known somebody with Parkinson's, or you maybe have a family member or anything like that, or just have seen a video of somebody walking or somebody with Parkinson's, you'll note that they shuffle their feet very, very often, and they'll tend to have a tremor in their hand. This tremor is involuntary. They're not doing it on purpose, but it is a result of the lack of these dopamine secreting neurons here in the brain that would work to kind of inhibit some of the motor stimulation. So, like anything else in the brain, if you alter something, you're going to see some pretty drastic effects from that. And Parkinson's disease, from the dysfunction of those dopamine secreting neurons in the basal nuclei, is a good example of that. So we'll talk a little bit about the diencephalon here, and we'll talk about some other locations as well, and we'll take a look at some sagittal sections of a brain. So if you imagine your cerebral hemispheres, your large cerebrum, just beneath that, and if you imagine the corpus callosum that we just talked about, just beneath that corpus callosum and kind of on the interior of the brain, deep within it, you have our diencephalon. Okay, so if you remember, the diencephalon was part of our prosencephalon. It differentiated from it when we were talking about our embryonic brain development. And we have a couple of parts in our diencephalon. We have the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus, and we have the epithalamus. The thalamus is going to contain, or at least take up, most of our diencephalon. This is where sensory signals coming from the periphery will synapse, they will be relayed here, and then they will continue up into the cerebral cortex. So all sensory information passes through the thalamus except for our special sense of smell. Okay, it's going to, it will not have to pass through our thalamus. Okay, we have our hypothalamus, which by its naming you can deduce that it is located just beneath the thalamus. Hypo meaning beneath the thalamus. This is important for different autonomic nervous system functions. It will regulate our body temperature. Our thirst center is located within our hypothalamus, circadian rhythms, and it also has a very important function and role in our endocrine system by releasing and inhibiting hormones. So these are hormones that travel from the hypothalamus down to the pituitary gland and stimulate the release of hormones from the pituitary. So if it's a releasing hormone, it stimulates the release of hormones from the pituitary. If it is an inhibiting hormone, it will inhibit the release of hormones from the pituitary. You also have a couple of hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, that are actually produced in the hypothalamus, but they are stored in the posterior pituitary. Okay, and associated with our hypothalamus, we have, like I said, our pituitary gland as well as our mammillary bodies, which is where our special sense of smell is going to be relayed. So I said that it bypasses our thalamus, and it's going to be relayed at these mammillary bodies within the brain associated with our hypothalamus. Our last main part that we'll talk about is our epithalamus. Prefix epi means on top or above, so this is going to be a region kind of above the thalamus and kind of near the posterior part, so near the dorsal aspect of our diencephalon. And it's going to contain one very prominent gland known as the pineal gland. This pineal gland you may have heard of. It is going to be responsible for secreting the hormone melatonin, and melatonin has a large role in regulating our sleep-wake cycle and then some different aspects of our mood. Okay. Now, our third ventricle is going to be contained within our diencephalon. Okay, so that's an important anatomical relationship to make between the ventricular system of the brain and the diencephalon, is that we have our third ventricle housed there. So if we take a look here, this kind of circled region here in red is going to, this is our largely our diencephalon. This, I should have probably also extended this down to include this little region right down here. This is part of your epithalamus, and this is your pineal gland here. Okay, this region right in here, this is your thalamus, which is, like we said, part of your diencephalon. This is your hypothalamus just beneath it. Okay, so just beneath here, but this is the majority of your diencephalon, which is your thalamus. Okay, so as I was saying, we have the diencephalon here in the middle of our brain region, and like I said, the thalamus is composing the large majority of our diencephalon. So if we continue inferiorly from the diencephalon, from the thalamus, from the hypothalamus, we'll get to a region known as the brainstem. And this brainstem is going to connect our diencephalon that we just discussed with the thalamus and hypothalamus and epithalamus down to the spinal cord. And it will be the continuation of our brainstem inferiorly that is the spinal cord. The brainstem is going to be involved with structures that are important for maintaining life, so different important reflexes in different centers like our cardiovascular center for our heart rate and blood pressure, for breathing and things like this. Okay, so one main region is our midbrain. And if you remember, our midbrain was our mesencephalon from our embryonic brain vesicles, and it remains undifferentiated, really unchanged as we grow and develop. It contains cerebral peduncles on the kind of posterior aspect of our midbrain here. We also contain the cerebral aqueduct, which, if you remember, this is the connecting stalk between the third and fourth ventricles. That between the lateral ventricles and the third is known as the interventricular foramen. You also contain something known as the corpora quadrigemina. So corpora is referring to body, and quadrigemina is referring to kind of four twin-like structures. Okay, and so what you have here is you have two things known as superior colliculi, or a colliculus being singular, and two inferior colliculi, or colliculus being singular. The top two, the superior, are known as the visual reflex centers, and the two inferior are known as the auditory reflex centers or relay centers. This is where we are beginning to notice things whenever we see them. So our superior colliculi will coordinate visual reflexes if we see something move. And then our inferior colliculi will associate sounds with movements. So if we are doing something and we hear a loud noise behind us, we're able to turn and orient ourselves toward wherever that sound was coming from. So kind of like the startle reflex. If something startles you, if it's loud in a particular area, we're able to turn and we're able to localize kind of where that is coming from. We have two other regions within this white matter of the midbrain, known as the substantia nigra and the red nucleus, or the red nuclei. So substantia nigra literally translates to black stuff, and whenever you look at a section of the brain, it actually is dark. and it has different dopamine precursors in it, things like melanin that's going to give it this dark appearance. It is linked to the basal nuclei of the cerebrum, and then we have something known as the red nucleus or the red nuclei, and it's red largely due to some iron compounds and the blood that is found there. And it is a relay station, a relay nucleus for some signals that are descending. So if they're descending and they're going away from the nervous system, we know that that is a motor or an efferent signal that would be leaving the central nervous system. So the red nucleus is a relay station for some of those signals. We also have the pons and the medulla. So our pons is going to be part of our metencephalon, and it's going to be fixated just between the midbrain and our more inferior structure known as our medulla or medulla oblongata. This is going to be a kind of bridge of sorts between our lower medulla and our cerebrum. So a lot of signals will pass through this pons, and it's the region on the brain that you see kind of bulging out on the anterior aspect of the brainstem. Now we have our medulla, which is just the inferior aspect of our pons. It's going to be continuous with our spinal cord, and as it exits through the foramen magnum at the base of the brain, it's going to have the fourth ventricle kind of contained within it, so it'll make up the walls of the fourth ventricle. And it's going to be very important for a lot of our reflex activities that are autonomic in nature. So things like our cardiovascular rate, so the rate of our contraction of our heart and the heart rate. We have respirations controlled here, so our breathing. And then other important reflexes, things like vomiting, coughing, sneezing. These are actually protective actions and reflexes, and all of these are going to be controlled by motor centers that are found within our that are controlled within our medulla. So we have our midbrain here, we have our pons, and we have our medulla. So this region here is our midbrain. If you cut it, you may see part of that substantia nigra in the red nucleus. Here is our pons, which is this larger kind of bulbous swelling off the brainstem, and then just below it you have your medulla. This medulla would then continue inferiorly as your spinal cord as it exits through the foramen magnum, as we mentioned. So we'll take a look next at this more posterior lobe, being our cerebellum. Again, before we do that, here's our substantia nigra and our red nucleus. So you can see as a section through this region here of our brainstem, you can see these different regions. Here you can see part of the cerebral aqueduct, remember, connecting the third to the fourth ventricle. And here we see that substantia nigra and our red nucleus here. You can also see part of our superior colliculus. Remember, those were your visual kind of relay centers, and then you have your auditory relay or reflex centers just beneath that as your inferior colliculi. So our cerebellum, cerebellum translates to small brain. It's going to be located more dorsal and kind of inferior to our occipital lobe of our cerebrum. And this is going to be very important for coordinating muscle contractions, for smoothing out our movements as we walk and as we do things, as well as giving us an idea of where we are at in space. So when we take a look at the cerebellum, it is somewhat arranged like our cerebrum. It has two main parts. It kind of has a left part and a right part connected by this midline structure known as the vermis. But it contains different lobes. So it has three main lobes: the anterior, the posterior, and a small one known as the flocculonodular lobe. And then it will have things known as peduncles. And a peduncle in the nervous system is a term given to something that connects to something else. Okay, so here we can see our pons front, and we'll have different cerebellar peduncles that dive kind of from the pons and go into our cerebellum. So we have a superior cerebellar peduncle, we have a middle, and we have an inferior. We can also see the structure known as the arbor vitae. Arbor vitae translates to tree of life, and what you see is it is areas of white matter. So we know that this is axons of myelinated axons of neurons traveling up through the cerebellum in this pattern, and we call it the arbor vitae, which means the tree of life. So here we can see some of our peduncles. We can see a superior and an inferior, and we have our middle right here. So you can't see your you can't see your superior and your inferior very, very well whenever the cerebellum is actually whole. So you have to take a section of it, and once you take a section of it, then you can see your inferior and your superior cerebellar peduncles. So your cerebellum is going to receive signals from your brain, so motor signals, and it will also receive afferent or sensory signals from your muscles and whatnot traveling back up to the cerebellum, and it will take the motor command and the sensory command and kind of analyze them, and based on the motor signal and the sensory signal that it receives, it will result in some signal that is generally going to smooth out our actions and things like that. So we're going to pause there, and we'll pick up with the some functional brain anatomy in the next part.